The Brothers Karamazov. Novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Epilogue. Chapter 1. Plans for Mitia's escape. Very early, at 9 o'clock in the morning, 5 days after the trial, Alyosha went to Katerina Ivanovna's to talk over a matter of great importance to both of them, and to give her a message. She sat and talked to him in the very room in which she had once received Grushenka. In the next room Ivan Fyodorovich lay unconscious in a high fever. Katerina Ivanovna had immediately after the scene at the trial ordered the sick and unconscious man to be carried to her house, disregarding the inevitable gossip and general disapproval of the public. One of the two relations who lived with her had departed to Moscow immediately after the scene in court, the other remained. But if both had gone away, Katerina Ivanovna would have adhered to her resolution, and would have gone on nursing the sick man and sitting by him day and night. Vervinsky and Herzenstube were attending him. The famous doctor had gone back to Moscow, refusing to give an opinion as to the probable end of the illness. Though the doctors encouraged Katerina Ivanovna and Alyosha, it was evident that they could not yet give them positive hopes of recovery. Alyosha came to see his sick brother twice a day. But this time he had specially urgent business, and he foresaw how difficult it would be to approach the subject, yet he was in great haste. He had another engagement that could not be put off for that same morning, and there was need of haste. They had been talking for a quarter of an hour. Katerina Ivanovna was pale and terribly fatigued, yet at the same time in a state of hysterical excitement. She had a presentiment of the reason why Alyosha had come to her. "Don't worry about his decision," she said, with confident emphasis to Alyosha. "One way or another he is bound to come to it. He must escape. That unhappy man, that hero of honor and principle, not he. Not Dmitri Fyodorovich, but the man lying the other side of that door, who has sacrificed himself for his brother," Katya added, with flashing eyes, "told me the whole plan of escape long ago. You know he has already entered into negotiations. I've told you something already. You see, it will probably come off at the third atop from here, when the party of prisoners is being taken to Siberia. Oh, it's a long way off yet. Ivan Fyodorovich has already visited the superintendent of the third atop. But we don't know yet who will be in charge of the party, and it's impossible to find that out so long beforehand. Tomorrow perhaps I will show you in detail the whole plan which Ivan Fyodorovich left me on the eve of the trial in case of need. That was when, do you remember? You found us quarreling. He had just gone downstairs, but seeing you I made him come back. Do you remember? Do you know what we were quarreling about then?" "No, I don't," said Alyosha. "Of course he did not tell you. It was about that plan of escape. He had told me the main idea 3 days before, and we began quarreling about it at once and quarreled for 3 days. We quarreled because, when he told me that if Dmitri Fyodorovich were convicted he would escape abroad with that creature, I felt furious at once. I can't tell you why, I don't know myself why. Oh, of course, I was furious then about that creature, and that she, too, should go abroad with Dmitri," Katerina Ivanovna exclaimed suddenly, her lips quivering with anger. "As soon as Ivan Fyodorovich saw that I was furious about that woman, he instantly imagined I was jealous of Dmitri and that I still loved Dmitri. That is how our first quarrel began. I would not give an explanation, I could not ask forgiveness. I could not bear to think that such a man could suspect me of still loving that, and when I myself had told him long before that I did not love Dmitri, that I loved no one but him. It was only resentment against that creature that made me angry with him. 3 days later, on the evening you came, he brought me a sealed envelope, which I was to open at once, if anything happened to him. Oh, he foresaw his illness. He told me that the envelope contained the details of the escape, and that if he died or was taken dangerously ill, I was to save Mitia alone. Then he left me money, nearly 10,000, those notes to which the prosecutor referred in his speech, having learnt from someone that he had sent them to be changed. I was tremendously impressed to find that Ivan Fyodorovich had not given up his idea of saving his brother, and was confiding this plan of escape to me. though he was still jealous of me and still convinced that I loved Mitia. Oh, that was a sacrifice. No, you cannot understand the greatness of such self-sacrifice, Alexei Fyodorovich. I wanted to fall at his feet in reverence, but I thought at once that he would take it only for my joy at the thought of Mitia's being saved, and he certainly would have imagined that. And I was so exasperated at the mere possibility of such an unjust thought on his part that I lost my temper again, and instead of kissing his feet, flew into a fury again. Oh, I am unhappy. It's my character, my awful, unhappy character. Oh, you will see, I shall end by driving him, to abandon me for another with whom he can get on better, like Dmitri. But, no, I could not bear it, I should kill myself. And when you came in then, and when I called to you and told him to come back, I was so enraged by the look of contempt and hatred he turned on me that, do you remember? I cried out to you that it was he alone who had persuaded me that his brother Dmitri was a murderer. I said that malicious thing on purpose to wound him again. He had never persuaded me that his brother was a murderer. On the contrary, it was I who persuaded him. Oh, my vile temper was the cause of everything. I paved the way to that hideous scene at the trial. He wanted to show me that he was an honorable man, and that, even if I loved his brother, he would not ruin him for revenge or jealousy. So he came to the court. I am the cause of it all, I alone am to blame. Katya never had made such confessions to Alyosha before, and he felt that she was now at that stage of unbearable suffering when even the proudest heart painfully crushes its pride and falls vanquished by grief. Oh, Alyosha knew another terrible reason of her present misery, though she had carefully concealed it from him during those days since the trial, but it would have been for some reason too painful to him if she had been brought so low as to speak to him now about that. She was suffering for her treachery at the trial. And Alyosha felt that her conscience was impelling her to confess it to him, Alyosha, with tears and cries and hysterical writhings on the floor. But he dreaded that moment and longed to spare her. It made the commission on which he had come even more difficult. He spoke of Mitia again. It's all right, don't be anxious about him. She began again, sharply and stubbornly. All that is only momentary, I know him, I know his heart only too well. You may be sure he will consent to escape. It's not as though it would be immediately, he will have time to make up his mind to it. Ivan Fyodorovich will be well by that time and will manage it all himself. So that I shall have nothing to do with it. Don't be anxious, he will consent to run away. He has agreed already. Do you suppose he would give up that creature? And they won't let her go to him, so he is bound to escape. It's you he's most afraid of, he is afraid you won't approve of his escape on moral grounds. But you must generously allow it, if your sanction is so necessary, Katya added viciously. She paused and smiled. He talks about some him, she went on again, some cross he has to bear, some duty. I remember Ivan Fyodorovich told me a great deal about it, and if you knew how he talked, Katya cried suddenly. With feeling she could not repress, if you knew how he loved that wretched man at the moment he told me, and how he hated him, perhaps. At the same moment. And I heard his story and his tears with sneering disdain. Brute? Yes, I am a brute. I am responsible for his fever. But that man in prison is incapable of suffering, Katya concluded irritably. Can such a man suffer? Men like him never suffer. There was a note of hatred and contemptuous repulsion in her words. And yet it was she who had betrayed him. Perhaps because she feels how she's wronged him she hates him at moments, Alyosha thought to himself. He hoped that it was only at moments. In Katya's last words he detected a challenging note, but he did not take it up. I sent for you this morning to make you promise to persuade him yourself. Or do you, too, consider that to escape would be dishonorable, cowardly, or something, unchristian, perhaps? Katya added, even more defiantly. Oh, no. I'll tell him everything, muttered Alyosha. He asks you to come and see him today, he blurted out suddenly, looking her steadily in the face. She started, and drew back a little from him on the sofa. Me? Can that be? She faltered, turning pale. It can and ought to be. Alyosha began emphatically, growing more animated. He needs you particularly just now. I would not have opened the subject and worried you, if it were not necessary. He is ill, he is beside himself, he keeps asking for you. It is not to be reconciled with you that he wants you, but only that you would go and show yourself at his door. So much has happened to him since that day. He realizes that he has injured you beyond all reckoning. He does not ask your forgiveness. It's impossible to forgive me, he says himself, but only that you would show yourself in his doorway. It's so sudden, faltered Katya. I've had a presentiment all these days that you would come with that message. I knew he would ask me to come. It's impossible. Let it be impossible, but do it. Only think, he realizes for the first time how he has wounded you. The first time in his life, he had never grasped it before so fully. He said, if she refuses to come I shall be unhappy all my life. Do you hear? Though he is condemned to penal servitude for 20 years, he is still planning to be happy. Is not that piteous? Think, you must visit him, though he is ruined, he is innocent, broke like a challenge from Alyosha. His hands are clean, there is no blood on them. For the sake of his infinite sufferings in the future visit him now. Go, greet him on his way into the darkness, stand at his door, that is all. You ought to do it, you ought to, Alyosha concluded, laying immense stress on the word ought. I ought to, but I cannot. Katya moaned. He will look at me. I can't. Your eyes ought to meet. How will you live all your life, if you don't make up your mind to do it now? Better suffer all my life. You ought to go, Alyosha repeated with merciless emphasis. But why today, why at once? I can't leave our patient. You can for a moment. It will only be a moment. If you don't come, he will be in delirium by tonight. I would not tell you a lie, have pity on him. Have pity on me, Katya said, with bitter reproach, and she burst into tears. Then you will come, said Alyosha firmly, seeing her tears. I'll go and tell him you will come directly. No, don't tell him so on any account, cried Katya in alarm. I will come, but don't tell him beforehand, for perhaps I may go, but not go in. I don't know yet. Her voice failed her. She gasped for breath. Alyosha got up to go. And what if I meet anyone? She said suddenly, in a low voice, turning white again. That's just why you must go now, to avoid meeting anyone. There will be no one there, I can tell you that for certain. We will expect you, he concluded emphatically, and went out of the room. End of the chapter. Now. Chapter 2. For a moment the lie becomes truth. He hurried to the hospital where Mitia was lying now. The day after his fate was determined, Mitia had fallen ill with nervous fever, and was sent to the prison division of the town hospital. But at the request of several persons, Alyosha, Madame Holikov, Lise, etc., Dr. Vervinsky had put Mitia not with other prisoners, but in a separate little room, the one where Smerdakov had been. It is true that there was a sentinel at the other end of the corridor, and there was a grating over the window. So that Vervinsky could be at ease about the indulgence he had shown, which was not quite legal, indeed, but he was a kind-hearted and compassionate young man. He knew how hard it would be for a man like Mitia to pass at once so suddenly into the society of robbers and murderers, and that he must get used to it by degrees. The visits of relations and friends were informally sanctioned by the doctor and overseer, and even by the police captain. But only Alyosha and Grushenka had visited Mitia. Rakitin had tried to force his way in twice, but Mitia persistently begged Vervinsky not to admit him. Alyosha found him sitting on his bed in a hospital dressing gown, rather feverish, with a towel, soaked in vinegar and water, on his head. He looked at Alyosha as he came in with an undefined expression. But there was a shade of something like dread discernible in it. He had become terribly preoccupied since the trial. Sometimes he would be silent for half an hour together, and seemed to be pondering something heavily and painfully. Oblivious of everything about him. if he roused himself from his brooding and began to talk. He always spoke with a kind of abruptness and never of what he really wanted to say. He looked sometimes with a face of suffering at his brother. He seemed to be more at ease with Grushenka than with Alyosha. It is true, he scarcely spoke to her at all, but as soon as she came in, his whole face lighted up with joy. Alyosha sat down beside him on the bed in silence. This time Mitia was waiting for Alyosha in suspense, but he did not dare ask him a question. He felt it almost unthinkable that Katya would consent to come, and at the same time he felt that if she did not come, something inconceivable would happen. Alyosha understood his feelings. Trifon Borisovich, Mitia began nervously, has pulled his hole into pieces, I am told. He's taken up the flooring, pulled apart the planks, split up all the gallery, I am told. He is seeking treasure all the time, the 1,500 rubles which the prosecutor said I'd hidden there. He began playing these tricks, they say, as soon as he got home. Serve him right, the swindler. The guard here told me yesterday, he comes from there. Listen, began Alyosha. She will come, but I don't know when. Perhaps today, perhaps in a few days, that I can't tell. But she will come, she will, that's certain. Mitya started, would have said something, but was silent. The news had a tremendous effect on him. It was evident that he would have liked terribly to know what had been said, but he was again afraid to ask. Something cruel and contemptuous from Katya would have cut him like a knife at that moment. This was what she said among other things, that I must be sure to set your conscience at rest about escaping. If Ivan is not well by then she will see to it all herself. You've spoken of that already, Mitya observed musingly. And you have repeated it to Grusha, observed Alyosha. Yes, Mitya admitted. She won't come this morning. He looked timidly at his brother. She won't come till the evening. When I told her yesterday that Katya was taking measures, she was silent, but she set her mouth. She only whispered, let her. She understood that it was important. I did not dare to try her further. She understands now, I think, that Katya no longer cares for me, but loves Ivan. Does she? Broke from Alyosha. Perhaps she does not. Only she is not coming this morning, Mitya hastened to explain again. I asked her to do something for me. You know, Ivan is superior to all of us. He ought to live, not us. He will recover. Would you believe it, though Katya is alarmed about him, she scarcely doubts of his recovery, said Alyosha. That means that she is convinced he will die. It's because she is frightened she's so sure he will get well. Ivan has a strong constitution, and I, too, believe there's every hope that he will get well, Alyosha observed anxiously. Yes, he will get well. But she is convinced that he will die. She has a great deal of sorrow to bear. A silence followed. A grave anxiety was fretting Mitya. Alyosha, I love Grusha terribly, he said suddenly in a shaking voice, full of tears. They won't let her go out there to you, Alyosha put in at once. And there is something else I wanted to tell you, Mitya went on, with a sudden ring in his voice. If they beat me on the way or out there, I won't submit to it. I shall kill someone, and shall be shot for it. And this will be going on for 20 years. They speak to me rudely as it is. I've been lying here all night, passing judgment on myself. I am not ready. I am not able to resign myself. I wanted to sing a hymn, but if a guard speaks rudely to me, I have not the strength to bear it. For Grusha I would bear anything except blows. But she won't be allowed to come there. Alyosha smiled gently. Listen, brother, once for all, he said. This is what I think about it. And you know that I would not tell you a lie. Listen, you are not ready, and such a cross is not for you. What's more, you don't need such a martyr's cross when you are not ready for it. If you had murdered our father, it would grieve me that you should reject your punishment. But you are innocent, and such a cross is too much for you. You wanted to make yourself another man by suffering. I say, only remember that other man always, all your life and wherever you go, and that will be enough for you. Your refusal of that great cross will only serve to make you feel all your life an even greater duty, and that constant feeling will do more to make you a new man, perhaps, than if you went there. For there you would not endure it and would repine, and perhaps at last would say, I am quits. The lawyer was right about that. Such heavy burdens are not for all men. For some they are impossible. These are my thoughts about it, if you want them so much. If other men would have to answer for your escape, officers or soldiers, then I would not have allowed you, smiled Alyosha. But they declare, the superintendent of that atop told Ivan himself, that if it's well managed there will be no great inquiry, and that they can get off easily. Of course, bribing is dishonest even in such a case. But I can't undertake to judge about it, because if Ivan and Katya commissioned me to act for you, I know I should go and give bribes. I must tell you the truth. And so I can't judge of your own action. But let me assure you that I shall never condemn you. And it would be a strange thing if I could judge you in this. Now I think I've gone into everything. But I do condemn myself, cried Mitia. I shall escape, that was settled apart from you. Could Mitia Karamazov do anything but run away? But I shall condemn myself, and I will pray for my sin forever. That's how the Jesuits talk, isn't it? Just as we are doing? Yes. Alyosha smiled gently. I love you for always telling the whole truth and never hiding anything, cried Mitia, with a joyful laugh. So I have caught my Alyosha being Jesuitical. I must kiss you for that. Now listen to the rest, I'll open the other side of my heart to you. This is what I planned and decided. If I run away, even with money and a passport, and even to America, I should be cheered up by the thought that I am not running away for pleasure, not for happiness, but to another exile as bad, perhaps, as Siberia. It is as bad, Alyosha, it is. I hate that America, damn it, already. Even though Grusha will be with me. Just look at her, is she an American? She is Russian, Russian to the marrow of her bones. She will be homesick for the mother country, and I shall see every hour that she is suffering for my sake, that she has taken up that cross for me. And what harm has she done? And how shall I, too, put up with the rabble out there, though they may be better than I, every one of them? I hate that America already. And though they may be wonderful at machinery, every one of them, damn them, they are not of my soul. I love Russia, Alyosha. I love the Russian God, though I am a scoundrel myself. I shall choke there, he exclaimed, his eyes suddenly flashing. His voice was trembling with tears. So this is what I've decided, Alyosha, listen. He began again, mastering his emotion. As soon as I arrive there with Grusha, we will set to work at once on the land, in solitude, somewhere very remote, with wild bears. There must be some remote parts even there. I am told there are still redskins there, somewhere, on the edge of the horizon. So to the country of the last of the Mohicans, and there we'll tackle the grammar at once. Grusha and I work and grammar, that's how we'll spend 3 years. And by that time we shall speak English like any Englishman. And as soon as we've learnt it, goodbye to America. We'll run here to Russia as American citizens. Don't be uneasy, we would not come to this little town. We'd hide somewhere, a long way off, in the north or in the south. I shall be changed by that time, and she will, too, in America. The doctors shall make me some sort of wart on my face, what's the use of their being so mechanical? Or else I'll put out one eye, let my beard grow a yard, and I shall turn grey, fretting for Russia. I dare say they won't recognize us. And if they do, let them send us to Siberia. I don't care. It will show it's our fate. We'll work on the land here, too, somewhere in the wilds, and I'll make up as an American all my life. But we shall die on our own soil. That's my plan, and it shan't be altered. Do you approve? Yes, said Alyosha, not wanting to contradict him. Mitia paused for a minute and said suddenly. And how they worked it up at the trial. Didn't they work it up? If they had not, you would have been convicted just the same, said Alyosha, with a sigh. Yes, people are sick of me here. God bless them, but it's hard, Mitia moaned miserably. Again there was silence for a minute. "Alyosha, put me out of my misery at once," he exclaimed suddenly. "Tell me, is she coming now, or not? Tell me? What did she say? How did she say it?" "She said she would come, but I don't know whether she will come today. It's hard for her, you know." Alyosha looked timidly at his brother. "I should think it is hard for her. Alyosha, it will drive me out of my mind. Grusha keeps looking at me. She understands. My God, calm my heart. What is it I want? I want Katya. Do I understand what I want? It's the headstrong, evil Karamazov spirit. No, I am not fit for suffering. I am a scoundrel, that's all one can say." "Here she is," cried Alyosha. At that instant Katya appeared in the doorway. For a moment she stood still, gazing at Mitia with a dazed expression. He leapt impulsively to his feet, and a scared look came into his face. He turned pale, but a timid, pleading smile appeared on his lips at once, and with an irresistible impulse he held out both hands to Katya. Seeing it, she flew impetuously to him. She seized him by the hands, and almost by force made him sit down on the bed. She sat down beside him, and still keeping his hands pressed them violently. Several times they both strove to speak, but stopped short and again gazed speechless with a strange smile, their eyes fastened on one another. So passed 2 minutes. "Have you forgiven me?" Mitia faltered at last, and at the same moment turning to Alyosha, his face working with joy, he cried, "Do you hear what I am asking? Do you hear? That's what I loved you for, that you are generous at heart." Broke from Katya. "My forgiveness is no good to you, nor yours to me. Whether you forgive me or not, you will always be a sore place in my heart, and I in yours, so it must be." She stopped to take breath. "What have I come for?" she began again with nervous haste. "To embrace your feet, to press your hands like this, till it hurts. You remember how in Moscow I used to squeeze them, to tell you again that you are my God, my joy, to tell you that I love you madly." She moaned in anguish, and suddenly pressed his hand greedily to her lips. Tears streamed from her eyes. Alyosha stood speechless and confounded. He had never expected what he was seeing. "Love is over, Mitia," Katya began again, "but the past is painfully dear to me. Know that you will always be so. But now let what might have been come true for 1 minute," she faltered, with a drawn smile, looking into his face joyfully again. "You love another woman, and I love another man, and yet I shall love you forever, and you will love me. Do you know that? Do you hear? Love me all your life," she cried, with a quiver almost of menace in her voice. "I shall love you, and, do you know, Katya," Mitia began, drawing a deep breath at each word, "do you know, 5 days ago, that same evening, I loved you. When you fell down and were carried out, all my life. So it will be, so it will always be." So they murmured to one another frantic words, almost meaningless, perhaps not even true, but at that moment it was all true, and they both believed what they said implicitly. "Katya," cried Mitia suddenly, "do you believe I murdered him? I know you don't believe it now, but then, when you gave evidence, surely you did not believe it." "I did not believe it even then. I've never believed it. I hated you, and for a moment I persuaded myself. While I was giving evidence I persuaded myself and believed it, but when I'd finished speaking I left off believing it at once. Don't doubt that. I have forgotten that I came here to punish myself," she said, with a new expression in her voice, quite unlike the loving tones of a moment before. "Woman, yours is a heavy burden," broke, as it were, involuntarily from Mitia. "Let me go," she whispered. "I'll come again. It's more than I can bear now." She was getting up from her place, but suddenly uttered a loud scream and staggered back. Grushenka walked suddenly and noiselessly into the room. No one had expected her. Katya moved swiftly to the door, but when she reached Grushenka, she stopped suddenly, turned as white as chalk and moaned softly, almost in a whisper. "Forgive me." Grushenka stared at her and, pausing for an instant, in a vindictive, venomous voice, answered. We are full of hatred, my girl, you and I. We are both full of hatred. As though we could forgive one another. Save him, and I'll worship you all my life. You won't forgive her, cried Mitia, with frantic reproach. Don't be anxious, I'll save him for you, Katya whispered rapidly, and she ran out of the room. And you could refuse to forgive her when she begged your forgiveness herself? Mitia exclaimed bitterly again. Mitia, don't dare to blame her, you have no right to, Alyosha cried hotly. Her proud lips spoke, not her heart, Grushenka brought out in a tone of disgust. If she saves you I'll forgive her everything. She stopped speaking, as though suppressing something. She could not yet recover herself. She had come in, as appeared afterwards, accidentally, with no suspicion of what she would meet. Alyosha, run after her, Mitia cried to his brother, tell her, I don't know, don't let her go away like this. I'll come to you again at nightfall, said Alyosha, and he ran after Katya. He overtook her outside the hospital grounds. She was walking fast, but as soon as Alyosha caught her up she said quickly. No, before that woman I can't punish myself. I asked her forgiveness because I wanted to punish myself to the bitter end. She would not forgive me. I like her for that, she added, in an unnatural voice, and her eyes flashed with fierce resentment. My brother did not expect this in the least, muttered Alyosha. He was sure she would not come. No doubt. Let us leave that, she snapped. Listen, I can't go with you to the funeral now. I've sent them flowers. I think they still have money. If necessary, tell them I'll never abandon them. Now leave me, please. You are late as it is, the bells are ringing for the service. Leave me, please. End of the chapter. Chapter 3. Ilusha's funeral. The speech at the stone. He really was late. They had waited for him and had already decided to bear the pretty flower-decked little coffin to the church without him. It was the coffin of poor little Ilusha. He had died 2 days after Mitia was sentenced. At the gate of the house Alyosha was met by the shouts of the boys, Ilusha's schoolfellows. They had all been impatiently expecting him and were glad that he had come at last. There were about 12 of them, they all had their school bags or satchels on their shoulders. Father will cry, be with father, Ilusha had told them as he lay dying, and the boys remembered it. Kolya Krasotkin was the foremost of them. How glad I am you've come, Karamazov, he cried, holding out his hand to Alyosha. It's awful here. It's really horrible to see it. Snigoyev is not drunk, we know for a fact he's had nothing to drink today, but he seems as if he were drunk. I am always manly, but this is awful. Karamazov, if I am not keeping you, one question before you go in. What is it, Kolya? Said Alyosha. Is your brother innocent or guilty? Was it he killed your father or was it the valet? As you say, so it will be. I haven't slept for the last 4 nights for thinking of it. The valet killed him, my brother is innocent, answered Alyosha. That's what I said, cried Smurov. So he will perish an innocent victim, exclaimed Kolya, though he is ruined he is happy. I could envy him. What do you mean? How can you? Why? Cried Alyosha surprised. Oh, if I, too, could sacrifice myself some day for truth, said Kolya with enthusiasm. But not in such a cause, not with such disgrace and such horror, said Alyosha. Of course, I should like to die for all humanity, and as for disgrace, I don't care about that, our names may perish. I respect your brother. And so do I. The boy, who had once declared that he knew who had founded Troy, cried suddenly and unexpectedly, and he blushed up to his ears like a peony as he had done on that occasion. Alyosha went into the room. Ilusha lay with his hands folded and his eyes closed in a blue coffin with a white frill round it. His thin face was hardly changed at all, and strange to say there was no smell of decay from the corpse. The expression of his face was serious and, as it were, thoughtful. His hands, crossed over his breast, looked particularly beautiful. As though chiseled in marble. There were flowers in his hands and the coffin, inside and out, was decked with flowers, which had been sent early in the morning by Lise Holikov. But there were flowers too from Katerina Ivanovna, and when Alyosha opened the door, the captain had a bunch in his trembling hands and was strewing them again over his dear boy. He scarcely glanced at Alyosha when he came in, and he would not look at anyone, even at his crazy weeping wife, Mama, who kept trying to stand on her crippled legs to get a nearer look at her dead boy. Nina had been pushed in her chair by the boys close up to the coffin. She sat with her head pressed to it, and she too was no doubt quietly weeping. Snigoyev's face looked eager, yet bewildered and exasperated. There was something crazy about his gestures and the words that broke from him. "Old man, dear old man," he exclaimed every minute, gazing at Ilusha. It was his habit to call Ilusha old man, as a term of affection when he was alive. "Father, give me a flower, too, take that white one out of his hand and give it me," the crazy mother begged, whimpering. Either because the little white rose in Ilusha's hand had caught her fancy or that she wanted one from his hand to keep in memory of him, she moved restlessly, stretching out her hands for the flower. "I won't give it to anyone, I won't give you anything," Snigoyev cried callously. "They are his flowers, not yours. Everything is his, nothing is yours." "Father, give mother a flower," said Nina, lifting her face wet with tears. "I won't give away anything, and to her less than anyone." She didn't love Ilusha. She took away his little cannon and he gave it to her. The captain broke into loud sobs at the thought of how Ilusha had given up his cannon to his mother. The poor, crazy creature was bathed in noiseless tears, hiding her face in her hands. The boys, seeing that the father would not leave the coffin and that it was time to carry it out, stood round it in a close circle and began to lift it up. "I don't want him to be buried in the churchyard," Snigoyev wailed suddenly. "I'll bury him by the stone, by our stone. Ilusha told me to. I won't let him be carried out." He had been saying for the last 3 days that he would bury him by the stone, but Alyosha, Krasotkin, the landlady, her sister and all the boys interfered. What an idea, bury him by an unholy stone, as though he had hanged himself. The old landlady said sternly, "There in the churchyard the ground has been crossed. He'll be prayed for there. One can hear the singing in church and the deacon reads so plainly and verbally that it will reach him every time, just as though it were read over his grave." At last the captain made a gesture of despair as though to say, "Take him where you will." The boys raised the coffin, but as they passed the mother, they stopped for a moment and lowered it that she might say goodbye to Ilusha. But on seeing the precious little face, which for the last 3 days she had only looked at from a distance, she trembled all over and her grey head began twitching spasmodically over the coffin. "Mother, make the sign of the cross over him, give him your blessing, kiss him," Nina cried to her. But her head still twitched like an automaton, and with a face contorted with bitter grief she began. Without a word, beating her breast with her fist. They carried the coffin past her. Nina pressed her lips to her brother's for the last time as they bore the coffin by her. As Alyosha went out of the house he begged the landlady to look after those who were left behind, but she interrupted him before he had finished. "To be sure, I'll stay with them, we are Christians, too." The old woman wept as she said it. They had not far to carry the coffin to the church, not more than 300 paces. It was a still, clear day, with a slight frost. The church bells were still ringing. Snigoyev ran fussing and distracted after the coffin, in his short old summer overcoat, with his head bare and his soft, old, wide-brimmed hat in his hand. He seemed in a state of bewildered anxiety. At one minute he stretched out his hand to support the head of the coffin and only hindered the bearers, at another he ran alongside and tried to find a place for himself there. A flower fell on the snow and he rushed to pick it up as though everything in the world depended on the loss of that flower. "And the crust of bread, we've forgotten the crust," he cried suddenly in dismay. But the boys reminded him at once that he had taken the crust of bread already and that it was in his pocket. He instantly pulled it out and was reassured. "Ilusha told me to, Ilusha," he explained at once to Alyosha. "I was sitting by him one night and he suddenly told me, 'Father, when my grave is filled up, crumble a piece of bread on it so that the sparrows may fly down. I shall hear, and it will cheer me up not to be lying alone." "That's a good thing," said Alyosha, "we must often take some." Every day," said the captain quickly, seeming cheered at the thought. They reached the church at last and set the coffin in the middle of it. The boys surrounded it and remained reverently standing so, all through the service. It was an old and rather poor church, many of the icons were without settings. But such churches are the best for praying in. During the Mass Snigoyev became somewhat calmer, though at times he had outbursts of the same unconscious and, as it were, incoherent anxiety. At one moment he went up to the coffin to set straight the cover or the wreath. When a candle fell out of the candlestick he rushed to replace it and was a fearful time fumbling over it. Then he subsided and stood quietly by the coffin with a look of blank uneasiness and perplexity. After the epistle he suddenly whispered to Alyosha, who was standing beside him, that the epistle had not been read properly but did not explain what he meant. During the prayer, like the cherubim, he joined in the singing but did not go on to the end. Falling on his knees, he pressed his forehead to the stone floor and lay so for a long while. At last came the funeral service itself and candles were distributed. The distracted father began fussing about again, but the touching and impressive funeral prayers moved and roused his soul. He seemed suddenly to shrink together and broke into rapid, short sobs, which he tried at first to smother. But at last he sobbed aloud. When they began taking leave of the dead and closing the coffin, he flung his arms about, as though he would not allow them to cover Ilusha, and began greedily and persistently kissing his dead boy on the lips. At last they succeeded in persuading him to come away from the step, but suddenly he impulsively stretched out his hand and snatched a few flowers from the coffin. He looked at them and a new idea seemed to dawn upon him, so that he apparently forgot his grief for a minute. Gradually he seemed to sink into brooding and did not resist when the coffin was lifted up and carried to the grave. It was an expensive one in the churchyard close to the church. Katerina Ivanovna had paid for it. After the customary rites the grave diggers lowered the coffin. Snigoyev with his flowers in his hands bent down so low over the open grave that the boys caught hold of his coat in alarm and pulled him back. He did not seem to understand fully what was happening. When they began filling up the grave, he suddenly pointed anxiously at the falling earth and began trying to say something, but no one could make out what he meant, and he stopped suddenly. Then he was reminded that he must crumble the bread and he was awfully excited, snatched up the bread and began pulling it to pieces and flinging the morsels on the grave. "Come, fly down, birds, fly down, sparrows," he muttered anxiously. One of the boys observed that it was awkward for him to crumble the bread with the flowers in his hands and suggested he should give them to someone to hold for a time. But he would not do this and seemed indeed suddenly alarmed for his flowers, as though they wanted to take them from him altogether. And after looking at the grave, and as it were, satisfying himself that everything had been done and the bread had been crumbled, he suddenly, to the surprise of everyone, turned, quite composedly even, and made his way homewards. But his steps became more and more hurried, he almost ran. The boys and Alyosha kept up with him. "The flowers are for Mama, the flowers are for Mama. I was unkind to Mama," he began exclaiming suddenly. Someone called to him to put on his hat as it was cold. But he flung the hat in the snow as though he were angry and kept repeating, "I won't have the hat, I won't have the hat." Smurov picked it up and carried it after him. All the boys were crying, and Kolya and the boy who discovered about Troy most of all. Though Smurov, with the captain's hat in his hand, was crying bitterly too, he managed, as he ran, to snatch up a piece of red brick that lay on the snow of the path, to fling it at the flock of sparrows that was flying by. He missed them, of course, and went on crying as he ran. Halfway, Snigoyev suddenly stopped, stood still for half a minute, as though struck by something, and suddenly turning back to the church, ran towards the deserted grave. But the boys instantly overtook him and caught hold of him on all sides. Then he fell helpless on the snow as though he had been knocked down, and struggling, sobbing, and wailing, he began crying out, "Ilusha, old man, dear old man." Alyosha and Kolya tried to make him get up, soothing and persuading him. "Captain, give over, a brave man must show fortitude," muttered Kolya. "You'll spoil the flowers," said Alyosha, "and Mama is expecting them. She is sitting crying because you would not give her any before. Ilusha's little bed is still there." "Yes, yes, Mama." Snigoyev suddenly recollected. "They'll take away the bed, they'll take it away," he added as though alarmed that they really would. He jumped up and ran homewards again. But it was not far off and they all arrived together. Snigoyev opened the door hurriedly and called to his wife with whom he had so cruelly quarrelled just before. "Mama, poor crippled darling, Ilusha has sent you these flowers," he cried, holding out to her a little bunch of flowers that had been frozen and broken while he was struggling in the snow. But at that instant he saw in the corner, by the little bed, Ilusha's little boots, which the landlady had put tidily side by side. Seeing the old, patched, rusty-looking, stiff boots, he flung up his hands and rushed to them, fell on his knees, snatched up one boot and, pressing his lips to it, began kissing it greedily, crying, "Ilusha, old man, dear old man, where are your little feet? Where have you taken him away? Where have you taken him?" the lunatic cried in a heart-rending voice. Nina, too, broke into sobs. Kolya ran out of the room, the boys followed him. At last Alyosha too went out. "Let them weep," he said to Kolya, "it's no use trying to comfort them just now. Let us wait a minute and then go back." "No, it's no use, it's awful," Kolya assented. "Do you know, Karamazov," he dropped his voice so that no one could hear them, "I feel dreadfully sad, and if it were only possible to bring him back, I'd give anything in the world to do it." "Ah, so would I," said Alyosha. "What do you think, Karamazov? Had we better come back here tonight? He'll be drunk, you know." "Perhaps he will. Let us come together, you and I, that will be enough, to spend an hour with them, with the mother and Nina. If we all come together we shall remind them of everything again," Alyosha suggested. "The landlady is laying the table for them now, there'll be a funeral dinner or something, the priest is coming, shall we go back to it, Karamazov?" "Of course," said Alyosha. "It's all so strange, Karamazov, such sorrow and then pancakes after it, it all seems so unnatural in our religion." "They are going to have salmon, too," the boy who had discovered about Troy observed in a loud voice. "I beg you most earnestly, Kartashov, not to interrupt again with your idiotic remarks, especially when one is not talking to you and doesn't care to know whether you exist or not," Kolya snapped out irritably. The boy flushed crimson but did not dare to reply. Meantime they were strolling slowly along the path and suddenly Smurov exclaimed, "There's Ilusha's stone, under which they wanted to bury him." They all stood still by the big stone. Alyosha looked and the whole picture of what Snigoyev had described to him that day, how Ilusha, weeping and hugging his father, had cried, "Father, father, how he insulted you," rose at once before his imagination. A sudden impulse seemed to come into his soul. With a serious and earnest expression he looked from one to another of the bright, pleasant faces of Ilusha's schoolfellows, and suddenly said to them, "Boys, I should like to say one word to you, here at this place." The boys stood round him and at once bent attentive and expectant eyes upon him. "Boys, we shall soon part. I shall be for some time with my two brothers, of whom one is going to Siberia and the other is lying at death's door. But soon I shall leave this town, perhaps for a long time, so we shall part. Let us make a compact here, at Ilusha's stone, that we will never forget Ilusha and one another. And whatever happens to us later in life, if we don't meet for 20 years afterwards, let us always remember how we buried the poor boy at whom we once threw stones, do you remember, by the bridge? And afterwards we all grew so fond of him. He was a fine boy, a kind-hearted, brave boy, he felt for his father's honor and resented the cruel insult to him and stood up for him. And so in the first place, we will remember him, boys, all our lives. And even if we are occupied with most important things, if we attain to honor or fall into great misfortune, still let us remember how good it was once here, when we were all together, united by a good and kind feeling which made us, for the time we were loving that poor boy, better perhaps than we are. My little doves, let me call you so, for you are very like them, those pretty blue birds, at this minute as I look at your good dear faces. My dear children, perhaps you won't understand what I am saying to you, because I often speak very unintelligibly, but you'll remember it all the same and will agree with my words some time. You must know that there is nothing higher and stronger and more wholesome and good for life in the future than some good memory, especially a memory of childhood, of home. People talk to you a great deal about your education, but some good, sacred memory, preserved from childhood, is perhaps the best education. If a man carries many such memories with him into life, he is safe to the end of his days, and if one has only one good memory left in one's heart, even that may sometime be the means of saving us. Perhaps we may even grow wicked later on, may be unable to refrain from a bad action, may laugh at men's tears and at those people who say as Collier did just now, I want to suffer for all men, and may even jeer spitefully at such people. But however bad we may become, which God forbid, yet, when we recall how we buried Ilusha, how we loved him in his last days, and how we have been talking like friends all together, at this stone, the cruelest and most mocking of us, if we do become so, will not dare to laugh inwardly at having been kind and good at this moment. What's more, perhaps, that one memory may keep him from great evil and he will reflect and say, yes, I was good and brave and honest then. Let him laugh to himself, that's no matter, a man often laughs at what's good and kind. That's only from thoughtlessness. But I assure you, boys, that as he laughs he will say at once in his heart, no, I do wrong to laugh, for that's not a thing to laugh at. That will be so, I understand you, Karamazov, cried Collier, with flashing eyes. The boys were excited and they, too, wanted to say something, but they restrained themselves, looking with intentness and emotion at the speaker. I say this in case we become bad, Alyosha went on, but there's no reason why we should become bad, is there, boys? Let us be, first and above all, kind, then honest, and then let us never forget each other. I say that again. I give you my word for my part that I'll never forget one of you. Every face looking at me now I shall remember even for 30 years. Just now Collier said to Kartashov that we did not care to know whether he exists or not. But I cannot forget that Kartashov exists and that he is not blushing now as he did when he discovered the founders of Troy, but is looking at me with his jolly, kind, dear little eyes. Boys, my dear boys, let us all be generous and brave like Ilusha, clever, brave and generous like Collier, though he will be ever so much cleverer when he is grown up, and let us all be as modest, as clever and sweet as Kartashov. But why am I talking about those two? You are all dear to me, boys, from this day forth. I have a place in my heart for you all, and I beg you to keep a place in your hearts for me. Well, and who has united us in this kind, good feeling which we shall remember and intend to remember all our lives? Who, if not Ilusha, the good boy, the dear boy, precious to us forever? Let us never forget him. May his memory live forever in our hearts from this time forth. Yes, yes, forever, forever. The boys cried in their ringing voices, with softened faces. Let us remember his face and his clothes and his poor little boots, his coffin and his unhappy, sinful father, and how boldly he stood up for him alone against the whole school. We will remember, cried the boys. He was brave, he was good. Ah, how I loved him, exclaimed Collier. Ah, children, ah, dear friends, don't be afraid of life. How good life is when one does something good and just. Yes, yes, the boys repeated enthusiastically. Karamazov, we love you. A voice, probably Kartashov's, cried impulsively. We love you, we love you. They all caught it up. There were tears in the eyes of many of them. Hurrah for Karamazov, Kolya shouted ecstatically. And may the dead boy's memory live forever, Alyosha added again with feeling. Forever. The boys chimed in again. Karamazov, cried Kolya, can it be true what's taught us in religion, that we shall all rise again from the dead and shall live and see each other again, all, Ilusha too? Certainly we shall all rise again, certainly we shall see each other and shall tell each other with joy and gladness all that has happened. Alyosha answered, half laughing, half enthusiastic. Ah, how splendid it will be! Broke from Kolya. Well, now we will finish talking and go to his funeral dinner. Don't be put out at our eating pancakes, it's a very old custom and there's something nice in that, laughed Alyosha. Well, let us go. And now we go hand in hand. And always so, all our lives hand in hand. Hurrah for Karamazov, Kolya cried once more rapturously, and once more the boys took up his exclamation, hurrah for Karamazov. The end. Thank you. Thank you.